Hi, I'm Charlie Fisher. I'm from the architecture practice Transition by Design, a cooperative based in Oxford. Today I'm going to tell you a little bit about community land trusts, what they are, how they operate, how they're financed, and some case studies from across the country. So let's get started. Before getting into what a community land trust is, I think it's important to situate it within the wider community-led housing movement. And that's generally defined along these three routes. The first is that there is meaningful community engagement and consent occurring throughout the process. Now, the community doesn't necessarily have to initiate or manage the development themselves, or even build the homes by hand, though some may do. And this leads into the second one, that the local community group or organisation owns or manages or stewards the homes and in a manner of their choosing. So they're in the driving seat. And then finally, that you can point to it on a map, that the benefits to the local area and specified community must be clearly defined and legally protected in perpetuity. That's often through an asset lock. And I generally talk about the ways in which the identities of different groups occur through using the word mechanisms, but some other people call them models. And for the purposes of this, we talk about organisations that look inwardly, look to satisfy their members or their residents, and organisations that look outwards to a wider community. So you might be thinking, what's the difference between a cooperative and a community land trust? And I think a lot of this comes down to identity. What a community has experience of using in the past, what might particularly resonate with them if they've got a cooperative shop or something like that in their area. What political systems surround all of this? So funding support, political support, policy support at a local and national level might affect the decision to choose a particular identity. And that also may affect the way that a local authority looks at a cooperative or community land trust. An example of this in quite a lot of urban areas in the UK is the link between the cooperative movement and the labour movements within cities. And so there's a political and practical framework that wraps around choosing a cooperative model as the identity. Now let's get into the basics of what a community land trust is. I've already said that the identity is often around a wider community of benefit, whether that be a particular group of people, a neighbourhood, a city, a county, but there's a wide benefit there. And generally they follow this process. So they form a group. There's no fixed legal form for a community land trust. Often they're community benefit societies, but there can be a whole range of other things based on what that particular group or area has as their mission, their vision. And they split that up based on what the governance should be like to be a representative democratic organisation. It's totally up to them how they split it. Often this is around residents, neighbours and professionals, but it doesn't have to be split a third equally. Although the residents, the people that live in these homes, should have an active voice as well as people that live around the homes. And community land trusts can own more than just housing. So it can be fields, shops, post offices, green space, urban public space, as we'll talk about in some of the case studies. And the second act usually is to get land. So they've coalesced around a particular issue, and now this group of citizens is looking for land, and that has generally in the past gone through being gifted it or through purchasing it, whether that's a very low cost transfer from a local authority for £1, as some schemes have, through to paying the market price, depending on what the purpose of that project is, the purpose of the organisation is. And the important bit here is that the value is then locked into the trust with the intention for it never to be sold again. So this is a model that is anti-speculation. And finally, they build something. So as I've said, not necessarily homes, but they do a project on that land. They take over existing properties. The way that's financed could be separated from the way that the land is owned and leased. The origins of the CLT movement Often people point back to Henry George and this publication, Progress and Poverty, which led to the proposals around land value taxation. Things had happened before this point, but this is a key milestone in the history of community land trusts. And then towards the end of the 19th century, the Garden Cities movement with Ebenezer Howard. Then a big milestone in the community land trust history is the Gramdan movement in India. A follower of Gandhi, Vinoba Bhave, started a land donation movement near Hyderabad in central India. The next step in this journey is the Black Civil Rights movement in the south of the USA, where Bob Swan and others pulled together a model influenced by the Garden Cities movement for subsistence farming. And this came to a sort of focus in Burlington, in Vermont, in the early 80s, where Bernie Sanders, who was at the time the mayor of Burlington, brought forward the Champlain Housing Trust of today, which owns 660 affordable homes and has over 2,000 members. It's one of the biggest land trusts in the USA and the world. And this is where the journey starts for the UK. So having undertaken Garden Cities movement, and that being a lot of the origin story, the first organisations that called themselves community trusts, that identified with the USA Community Land Trust model, was Stonesfield in West Oxfordshire, which is in our Thames Valley area. And in 1983, they put some land into a trust. It was built in the pub car park, and they went on to build a few other schemes over the following 30 years and still exist today, still have an active board. Little bits happened each year. Attempts in different cities were made to get CLTs happening, but it wasn't until 2008 legal definition that really things started to take off. And this definition, the core of this definition of the Housing and Regeneration Act, was that the body is established for the express purpose of furthering the social, economic and environmental interests of a local community. By acquiring and managing land and other assets, it has to be for people that live or work in a specified area, so there's a geographical element, and all those people have to have the opportunity to become members. So this is where the openness of the organisation is key, and the members of that trust control the trust. In the UK, it's been a growing movement. So since that first point in 1983, where Stonesfield was set up, they were the first organisation until the 90s. Little bits happened along the way, but it wasn't until 2006 when the National Demonstration Programme happened, which was 15 urban and 15 rural community land trusts getting started up. In the end, the rural ones were the ones that were taken forward. And then after that, the legal definition came, and the the body for community land trusts started, which was where the boom really happened. And it went from 34 community land trusts at that point to now as being in a position of over 300 community land trusts. And there's three principal ways that they get funded. So through grant and free money that they don't have to ever pay back or have to pay interest on. And that comes through people living in the scheme, things that the organisation or people in the organisation have done before, so being able to use their assets as an organisation, philanthropic donors and government funds. The second is around land and partnership, so using discounted public land to finance a scheme. So getting a low-cost transfer, getting a lease at a low cost that allows borrowing from the wider financial sector. There are loans available to community land trusts and community-led housing groups. Some are repayment loans, some very large-scale debt through pension providers. Community shares and bonds are very popular. And then sort of short-term risk equity, where it's a very high rate if you proceed, but if you don't proceed, then you don't pay anything at all. And so it really encourages people to try in the early stages when they're borrowing smaller amounts of money. Now we've covered the basics of what a CLT is, let's have a look at some case studies from across the country. Some of these are just a few homes at a time in rural village locations, But we're now starting to see urban locations come forwards which are proposing a few hundred homes into a community land trust and really showing the potential of what this could offer at a larger scale. And in Oxfordshire, where Stonesfield set off the first one, they went on to birth the second one in Oxfordshire, which was the Oxfordshire Community Land Trust. This Community Land Trust is an umbrella community land trust for the entire county, so the intention was that where Stonesfield was about looking after that village, making sure that village survives in a context of people disappearing due to rising house prices across the 70s and 80s. The wider Community Land Trust was intended to be able to help set up more community land trusts at a small scale, provide support, achieve a bigger scale at this county level. And that set up in 2003-04, incorporated in 2006, and is currently doing their first project at Dean Court, which is just the west of Oxford. But since then there's been a few others, Stamford in the Vale CLT, which is currently on a pause, but Tame CLT set up in the last few years, as well as Hook Norton Low Carbon. A good example of urban communities starting to champion a citizen-led community land trust model was the London CLT, at the time called East London CLT, and their first project in Tower Hamlets. Now, London citizens had been campaigning for a community land trust for quite some time, but it wasn't until the hustings in 2012, the London mayoral election, where candidates were asked, would you support a community land trust? And one by one they pledged their support. Now, originally they were looking for a scheme on the Olympic Village site. However, they got offered a sort of starter project by working on the St Clement's Hospital site. And through the community jumping behind and applying pressure through community organising techniques, by the end of that year they were building visions, they were interacting with the scheme. Now, how it works broadly is on the right here is the St Clement's Hospital site, the architect's illustration, and at the bottom you can see the older buildings which face onto the main road. Galliford Try were the developer, and they developed out the housing. They built all of the new build housing across the site. The intention was for the Ricardo Community Foundation, which was going to be the freeholding community land trust on this scheme. They would own all of the community land trust properties. However, that's not quite how it's happened in the end. And then they would lease out to 23 households on 250-year leases from the trust. They decided to take on new build properties because they cost less to run each year in heating and other costs, but they're spread across the development. And people have moved in now. One of the key elements of this scheme is that everyone that's moved in there pays 35% of a median monthly income. And they work that, they get a mortgage based on what they can pay per month. When they sell their home, the same formula is going to be used for the sale to the next property. So they always remain affordable, these 23 homes. They'll always be at around a third of the area median income. Hopefully that gives you a feel for what community land trusts are, how they operate, how they're financed. If you want to find out a bit more about community land trusts or community-led housing in general, then I recommend having a look at the website of the Collaborative Housing Hub. There's lots of information on there, as well as links for contact details. And our architecture practice, Transition by Design, we are passive house architects. We really care about environmental low carbon design, but we also get really involved in the early stages of a project, whether that be participatory workshops with communities or understanding the implications of finance on design. We take that all the way through the construction phase through to completion. So what makes quite an unusual architectural skill set. Also unusual is the amount of action research that we do. So we do work on affordable housing models, the housing crisis and homelessness. We do lots of events on these as well. If you want to find out more about our architectural skill set or our action research, go to our website. And if you want to get in touch with me, you can do so on Twitter. My handle is Fisher_Charlie, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thanks a lot.